Okay.
Okay, my name is Scott Osborne, and I am the president of the Royal United Services Institute of Vancouver Island. And our guest speaker here today is Dr. Perry Biddiscombe from the University of Victoria. And he is the author of The Last Nazis, SS Werewolf Guerrilla Resistance in Germany, 1944 to 1947. You probably can't see the book too well, but that's it with a big swastika on the front. And miss it. Now, Dr. Biddiscombe is the leading expert in the world on the SS Werewolf guerrilla movement. I want to thank you, Dr. Biddiscombe, for spending the time not only in coming to talk to us today, but also in putting it together and trying to figure out what you could talk about and what you couldn't, etc. And basically, Dr. Biddiscombe will be talking about the werewolf guerrilla movement in Germany during the final days of the Second World War. Now, this topic is certainly timely as it covers the largely unknown story of the unsuccessful guerrilla war in Nazi Germany during the end days of the Second World War, but also certainly because in the 21st century, and I would argue in the 20th century as well, seems to be that the most popular form of guerrilla warfare, certainly by non-state actors or weaker powers, is guerrilla warfare. And it doesn't look like it's going to go away anywhere soon. And of course, Afghanistan is a recent example of that. So Dr. Biddiscombe is going to talk for about 50 minutes. And I will pose about half a dozen general questions. And then we'll follow questions from the audience after that. So if you have any questions, please put them on the Zoom chat or question and answer Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and make them brief. We end no later than 2:30 p.m. And as usual, we're recording this talk. We will post it to our UCVI website as soon as possible. And as usual, I'll send out an email to all the members and let you know that it's on the website. So Dr. Biddiscombe, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much for that kind introduction. So as Scott indicated, I spent actually about 20 years of my life investigating and poring over the topic of Nazi guerrilla warfare. So I'm going to try and encapsulate here the essence, I guess, of what I learned during that process. So first of all, the Nazis rather melodramatically called their partisan warfare program Werewolf. And what they meant to suggest by that, it wasn't only lycanthropy, which seems like the obvious connotation, but they also wanted to suggest that, or their other reference point actually was home defense militia back during the 17th century, back during the 30 Years' War. And actually in 1914, a German journalist named Lunz, Hermann Lunz, he had written a famous book about irregular forces back during 30 Years' War. And this novel became exceedingly popular in early 20th century Germany. I think by 1940, it sold something like 500,000 copies. So it was a common reference point for people. And that's really what the Nazis were trying to evoke here, was this folkish self-defense impulse back in the 17th century. They're trying to tap into the spirit of that. Now, once some figures in the Nazi regime realized by about the spring of 1944 that the war had turned against them, that Germany might get invaded, they began to think about using every possible means to meet that contingency, including guerrilla warfare. So in the SS, it was first the organizational boss of the Waffen-SS, Gottlob Berger, who began thinking in this direction. And he contacted some officers who had been connected to the Black Reichswehr back in the 1920s, in the early Weimar period, sort of the underground army back then, and also the Border Patrol Service. Those people had experience in these kinds of things, and he asked them if they would contribute their expertise, to which some of them agreed. And so they set up a secret investigative unit to explore the possibilities that were open to the Germans in 1944. So by September 1944, because of these military disasters then that were unfolding for the Germans in both France and Belarusia, Germany was actually on the cusp of being invaded. And then the Werewolf program was actually created at the command of Heinrich Himmler. And at that time, the program was supposed to be a joint effort of the SS and the Nazi Party per se, That's actually the same combination that had launched the big mass militia in the fall of 1944. So that's a Volkssturm. Although in this case, it was really the SS who were predominant, and the Nazi party sort of faded into the background a little bit. The party was a bit lackluster, actually, with regard to the Werewolf project. Martin Bormann, who was the party secretary, didn't seem all that interested in it until fairly late into the war. There were some enthusiasts in the party structure, particularly the organizational boss of the party, Robert Lai. And Robert Lai was also the chief of the German Labor Front. So he set up a sort of a quasi-autonomous network of fighters called the Freikorps Adolf Hitler. But again, really the party sort of stood in the background, except in some cases where you had exceptionally vigorous local Kreisleiter or Gauleiter who were interested, and they stepped forward and devoted resources to the project. But otherwise, to return to the main point, the Werewolf actually was mainly an SS thing. And Himmler decided that within that sphere, within the SS, that he would allot the main organizational responsibility to the higher SS and police leaders. And I'm going to go here and try and call up my visuals here. Here we go. So here is the organizational chart of the SS Police Security Service in 1944. And you can see the HSSPF here in this structure. And he allotted them, again, the main responsibility for setting up the Werewolf. There were 23 of these guys scattered all over Greater Germany. They were actually based in the military home defense regions in Germany. So those were sort of the templates that the Wehrmacht used to raise and train troops. You can see them here. Here's a map of your defense regions in Germany in 1944. And within that realm, Himmler also wanted special attention paid to the borderland Wehrkreise, because the borderland Wehrkreise is where the enemy was first expected to show up. So there was a lot of attention paid here to these three Wehrkreise here along the western fringe of Germany, and also to East Prussia over here on the eastern fringe. And sorry about that. And also within that sphere, and within that spirit actually of paying a lot of attention to the border, Himmler also appointed the HSSPF out here in East Prussia, in Königsberg. He appointed him to be chief of the entire organization. So the title that this guy got was General Inspector for Special Abwehr. And his name was Hans Krutzman. He was the local HSSPF in East Prussia. He becomes chief of the entire thing. He was and by the way, I've got a picture of him, which I should slide down to here. Here he is here. Sorry. Oh, I should back up here a little bit. So here he is here, at about the time that the Werewolves were organized, actually. And I would argue that Krutzman actually wasn't all that great of a choice. By all accounts, he was lazy. And on top of that, he didn't exactly have a firm faith in the whole project. His faith in the thing was kind of shaky, and it got steadily more shaky as the end of the war approached, and he could see defeat coming. But nonetheless, in spite of that, Krutzman and the regional SS police commanders got busy, and they're training the Werewolves. And the Werewolves are starting to run sort of initial reconnaissance and sabotage operations along the fringe of the country by about October and November 1944. And there was a number of ways that these people could be deployed. So they could be deployed through infiltration through the front, or they could be dropped by parachute into the enemy communication zone. But Krutzman's main interest actually was in developing subterranean bunkers for these folks. And I'm going to go over here again. So subterranean bunkers, like here's a sketch from the Werewolf Combat Manual of one of these subterranean bunkers. So these would hold groups of maybe 5 or 6 people, both men and women. Krutzman was recruiting women as well as men. And then he would let these bunkers, or the idea anyway, was to let these bunkers get bypassed by advancing enemy forces. And then the werewolves could creep out of these underground funk holes, and then they could start their operations from there. And Krutzman also laid hundreds, probably thousands actually, of hidden ammunition dumps and food dumps also in areas that were likely to get overrun by the Allies. And you can see actually this is weapons captured from one of these dumps by the American Counterintelligence Corps in 1945. So the main intent at that time, in the fall of 1944 and then into the winter of 1945, wasn't really to prepare for the defeat of Germany, because in the Nazi reckoning, any talk about defeat was in and of itself defeatist. So verboten, in other words, all they really intended to do at that point in time was to try and delay their enemies. And they wanted to delay their enemies long enough for some kind of extra element to break in Germany's favor. So they figured maybe an East-West split, right, between the Russians on one side, the Western Allies on the other side. They were aware that they didn't get along all that well. Or maybe the tide of battle would turn because of the deployment of wonder weapons, right? The Germans had invested a lot of faith in that toward the end of the war. Sort of something, anything that would bail them out, right? And they were looking for something that would buy time until that would happen. So now, with regard to the organization of the werewolves, you might think, well, that's sort of the end of the story, right? The guys told us about the essential structure of the werewolves. But that's not the half of it, actually, because that doesn't account for the anarchic way in which the Nazi state was organized by 1944 and 1945. So in the course of affairs over 1944 and 1945, several other agencies also independently jumped into the project. So the Hitler Youth, for instance, Hitler Youth was comprised of all kinds of enthusiastic junior Nazis. They were dismayed by the advance of the enemy. They were led by Arthur Axmann, who was a Nazi stalwart and was interested in doing anything that might slow up the enemy advance. So they began training volunteers. They did that around the same time that Krutzman had launched his project within the SS sphere. Although in this case, Krutzman found out about this rival program pretty quickly, and he actually managed to get it folded into the SS program, so that the guy who was running the Hitler version of the program actually had to go and had to resituate himself at Krutzman's headquarters. Although that program still retained quite a degree of autonomy right up until the end of the war, that Hitler Youth training program. And actually, I've got a picture here of Hitler Youth training toward the end of the war. Whoops, too far there. So here you see them training with Panzerfaust or bazooka. The German army also got into the act independently. So they set up their own set of raiding units, which were called Streif Corps. And they began training volunteers for these Streif Corps back in the fall of 1944. And these Streif Corps were structured at platoon size. Their task was to infiltrate through the front, and then they would conduct sabotage and reconnaissance in the immediate rear of the front. So say within about 15 miles or so of the front. Also, on top of the Werewolf program, the SS had also set up a separate organization to support pro-German guerrilla warfare in countries outside Greater Germany. So these are areas that had already been evacuated by the Wehrmacht. So this was the notorious SS Jagdverbände, right, under Otto Skorzeny. And by the spring of 1945, yeah, that's the book about it. And by the spring of 1945, those units as well were withdrawing back into Greater Germany. And because they were conducting guerrilla operations, these guerrilla operations now, in effect, became werewolf operations. So these special units began functioning essentially as werewolves. And on top of all that, if that wasn't enough, also in March 1945, the Ministry of Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels also launched its own independent Werewolf program, because Goebbels was convinced that Krutzman wasn't doing enough to stir up the general population, especially because by this point in time, considerable swaths of Germany had been overrun. So now a lot of its population was sitting in occupied territories. So this would be the Rhineland in the west and big swaths of East Germany. So the propaganda ministry set up a special unit, and this special unit was given a powerful transmitter right outside Berlin. And on the 1st of April, 1945, they launched a Werewolf radio. And they began blasting out a general call to arms to all and sundry. So this was sort of a general call to arms. Even women and children were sort of beseeched to, rise up and set themselves upon the enemy, do whatever they could do in terms of sabotage, in terms of harassing the enemy. And they were also, by the way, provided with instructions by Werewolf radio on how to do that. So that the station tried to guide them in this regard. And also on top of that, the propaganda ministry also published handouts with illustrated guides for action. And actually I've got some illustrations here for you as well in this regard. So here's Goebbels himself in the spring of 1945. Here is an Allied send-up of Werewolf radio as sort of this toothless wonder, this mangy old dog. And here are some of these instruction guides that were published for the general population on how to accomplish sabotage. So spontaneous civilian actions right in occupied territory now also fell under the banner of the Werewolf, as did resistance by bypass soldiers in the Wehrmacht. So by this point in time, they had an increasing number of troops who had been bypassed by the Western Allies or bypassed by the Red Army. And some of them did not disarm. Some of them took off to remote areas. They retained their arms and they started to engage in harassment of the enemy, or they're at least foraging for supplies. So those people now also sort of fall under the Werewolf banner. A really good example of that, by the way, is 6th SS Mountain Army. 6th SS Mountain Army was actually ordered by the OKW to conduct, that's German High Command, to conduct guerrilla warfare. It was in the Taunus region. So I'm going to go down to a map here. So by the way, this is an American half-track in the process of fighting 6th SS Army, SS Mountain Army in Taunus. And Taunus would be right about, if I've got right about here. So just east of the Rhine River, that part of the country right there. So now you've got the number of guerrillas inflated from probably the thousands into the tens of thousands, right? And all of this organizational overlapping and confusion, I think, provides extra confirmation for an interpretational model of the Nazi state, which historians began to develop back in the 1970s, and I think has become pretty pervasive since that point in time. It's become dominant really among historians since that point in time. And this mode of interpretation is called functionalism. So this school of historians would be functionalist historians. And they argue, they make a number of claims, but one of their arguments is that for Hitler's own purposes, his own arcane reasons, his preferred management style was to offer sort of vague outlines for policy, and then he would let his underlings scramble to carry out these policy directives. And Hitler, in fact, would sort of assign responsibility for a policy to multiple lieutenants or multiple agencies, and then he would sort of let them compete to carry it out. And one of the arguments made by the functionalist historians is that this kind of policy had a radicalizing effect. Sometimes the rival centers of power would try and outdo each other in implementing the Führer's will as they saw it. And again, the argument is that this had a radicalizing effect. This argument has been most famously made with regard to the Holocaust, but you can see it here playing out with regard to the Werewolf program as well. So I guess probably the $64,000 question is that what happened, right? What actually happened as a result of all this werewolf organizing that I've just described? And the answer to that question, traditionally provided by historians, was nada, right? The Germans went through all these efforts, tried to organize all this stuff, and absolutely nothing at all came of it. The Germans had sort of botched the setup of the program, and then nothing came of it when push came to shove. And I would be the first to admit that a lot of these Krutzman guerrillas or Axeman guerrillas, right, once they were stranded along enemy lines of communication, they just gave up. That was probably the general tendency, actually. The general tendency for these guerrillas, as soon as they were away from immediate oversight, right, as soon as they were in the enemy hinterland, the tendency for them was just to either surrender, or some of them would just desert, or some of them, they just sort of picked up and they went home. Even some fanatics did that. In fact, I had communication with one of these guys when I was doing the research. He was a pretty fanatical guy, but he had basically done this. On the other hand, and I guess this is the key point, there were some fanatics who did not do that. And there's no doubt that stuff happened during this period. And it might not have been enough to change the flow of events, but it was more than nothing. And nothing, again, was the traditional view. And I think it'd be unfortunate to overlook that, because to me, anyway, it's a signal about just how deeply embedded Nazism still was, at least in the minds of some Germans, even at this late date in the war. So, by my count, werewolves destroyed at least a dozen bridges in Germany. That included an American pontoon bridge near Dusseldorf, where this was actually quite a clever piece of sabotage, where the saboteur found a vessel that was moored a little bit upstream of the bridge, and he simply cut the moorings on the vessel. And then the vessel got caught up in the spring freshet, and it floated down, and it smashed the pontoon bridge into 3 pieces. And then there were another couple of cases, no, more than a couple of cases actually, in Eastern Germany and Eastern Austria, where werewolf saboteurs tried to blow up bridges, but they failed, because it's pretty difficult to blow up a bridge. They also derailed trains here and there. And actually, I've got a picture here. You see Allied troops in the American 7th Army standing on top of a derailed train. There wasn't that much of that, because, to tell you the truth, there wasn't a whole lot of rolling stock actually still moving in Germany during this period, because of Allied bombing. It sort of disrupted their transportation network already. Werewolves blew up a train tunnel at Buchholz. This would be in the eastern fringe of Belgium, the part of eastern Belgium where the inhabitants speak German. They also badly damaged a rail yard at Ruckewinkel. This would be in the eastern part of Austria. They blew up 2 munitions trains, including one at Steinau in Silesia, and that killed 19 Soviet soldiers. They raided an American supply dump behind American lines at Bad Tynach. They set fire to part of a Soviet fuel dump at Heinfeld. They blew up Allied and Soviet troop facilities at Hindenburg, Berchtesgaden, Bremen, Mutzenach, Bunzlau, Isaac, killing well over 100 people in the course of doing that. They blew up Allied billets at Brixen and Neuss, although in those 2 particular cases, they were vacated by the time that the charges went off. They burned down a Soviet military hospital at Weipart. They conducted a lot of sniping attacks. There was quite a few sniping attacks by people in civilian clothes conducted in Germany in 1945. And again, I've got a few pictures here to illustrate this. So here you can see civilian snipers captured in Würzburg on the 4th of April, 1945. And here, about a month later, You can see a dead sniper with British troops standing around him in Bremen. He's got a sign propped up next to him telling people not to do that because this would be the consequence. So quite a bit of that. Actually, in the Palatine town of Bad Kreuznach, some of the sniping got so bad that it sort of reached the level of a low-grade insurgency. And I'll show you where Bad Kreuznach was. It would be actually quite close to the town. It's here, maybe right about here. So this town here, just a little bit west of the Rhine River. Werewolves conducted ambushes. So the victims of these ambushes actually included two of Field Marshal Montgomery's liaison officers. So they were killed on the Lüneburg Heath in northern Germany on the 21st of April, 1945. And I'll just sit down. This would be this guy right here. And also this guy over here. They actually also killed one of General Patton's G2 officers. He was killed near Odroth in Thuringia on the 7th of April. Werewolves waylaid and killed a Soviet officer at Neuhausen in East Prussia on the 28th and 29th of January, 1945. At Furstenberg, they overtook another Soviet officer. They beat him to death and decapitated him with a razor. Near Arbach, they overran two US officers on the 16th of April. They killed one and captured the other, and then they killed the guy whom they captured. And that was actually a Streifkorps unit that did that. They ambushed and wiped out Soviet vehicle columns in the Vienna forest and the eastern part of Moravia. At Kritzendorf in Austria, they destroyed 3 Soviet tanks and a number of vehicles in an attack on the 13th of April. At Alt-Ols in Silesia, they attacked a Soviet labor detachment. Didn't make much progress in this case because the Soviets used German civilian workers as human shields. In early April, Werewolves destroyed an American truck in the Taunus area with an IED, or what's now called an IED, injuring both occupants of the vehicle critically. Around the same time, they unbraked a train and they ran it over a broken overpass onto an American armored column, which was passing below. And I've actually got a picture of that. So that's this incident right here. They captured a French supply truck. They killed both its occupants, and that caused a shootout at Speer when they tried to drive that truck across a bridge over the Rhine River. In certain parts of Germany, particularly the Harz Mountains and the Black Forest, they ran sort of low-grade, localized guerrilla warfare. So the Harz Mountains would be up around here on the end here in Germany. Black Forest, actually, we got the legend here in the way, but Black Forest would be sort of right around here. So a good geographic conditions for those kind of campaigns in those areas. Those kind of campaigns actually sort of continued on at some low level into May and June 1945. So you have sort of literally dozens of ambushes and bomb attacks and sabotage incidents, wire cutting in those areas. Also notable was the Schwarzenberg region. The Schwarzenberg region was on the slopes of the Ore Mountains. So this would be this area right down here. And the problem there was that neither the Americans nor the Soviets effectively occupied that area for more than a month after the end of the war. So that allowed local werewolf resistance bands to get a toehold there. And this was a significant pocket. It was about maybe 600 square miles in breadth. It had about 250,000 people. A lot of refugees had flowed into it. And it became forum for a local civil war between anti-Nazi liberation committees called Antifas, so they'll ring a bell, and Nazi guerrillas. So these Nazi guerrillas actually were harboring for a while after the end of the war Martin Maschmann, who was the Gauleiter of Saxony. He was sort of hiding out with them until he was eventually caught by an Antifa patrol. And that situation was only brought to an end the latter part of June 1945 when the Red Army finally stepped forward and they occupied that area. I should also mention poisons as well. That was an important part of the story. The Werewolf headquarters had a lab where all kinds of elaborate poisons were developed. The Soviets actually complained about considerable numbers of their troops dying from poisoned liquor in East Prussia. So that would be 13 soldiers in the Soviet 24th Armored Brigade during the month of January 1945 alone. There were casualties amongst the Western Allies too, including 4 American soldiers poisoned by liquor that they bought at Wiesenfeld on the 23rd of April, 1945. Also, perhaps I think one of the worst aspects of the story is that even after the war ended, because of all the publicity which the Werewolf movement had got out of Werewolf Zender, right, the Werewolf radio, and because of all the, the publicity surrounding harassment techniques, low-grade trouble continued for a while. Low-grade trouble continued in occupied Germany for a couple of years after the end of the war. So this would be things like wire cutting. Wire cutting was actually rife in occupied Germany, stringing of decapitation wires across roadways, sabotage, attacks on individual Allied troops. Those are sort of part of the social landscape in occupied Germany up until about 1947, 1948. And actually I have another thing here to show you. So this would be a British chart with, let's go down here. This would be a British chart. Oh, by the way, I forgot to show this one. This is a blasted hotel and a blasted communication tower after a battle in the Harz Mountains. This is a guerrilla battle that occurred about 10 days after the actual fighting was supposed to have ended, actually in the Harz Mountains. And here's this chart I was mentioning a minute ago. This is a British chart of occupation or security incidents in the first year or so after the end of the war. On top of all that, thousands of SS troops fled into the Alps at the end of the war. They held out in remote regions there. They terrorized local farm folk because they were looking for food and shelter. And the last of those groups really only dispersed with the advent of cold weather over the winter of 1945, 1946. And I should also point out that werewolves were also tasked with fighting signs of defeatism on their own side, so amongst Germans. So werewolves in Bohemia were ordered to fire on German troops who were surrendering. Actually, some British soldiers in Bremen actually saw this happen. They saw armed civilians actually firing on German troops who were in the process of capitulating. At Tittefeld, up near Norden in northern Germany, werewolves on 9 May blew up 2 barracks that were occupied by their own troops because they were annoyed that the Wehrmacht had given up Norden without a fight. On the Baltic coast of northern Germany, some werewolves were also upset that a German airfield had fallen into British hands without a fight, so they blew up a couple of captured ME-110 fighters and a couple of V-1 buzz bombs, and they set a couple of hangars on fire in the process of doing it. Werewolves were also mixed up with scorched earth measures and vigilante actions aimed against German defeatists or collaborators. They damaged or they tried to damage economic infrastructure that they didn't want to see fall into Allied hands. So that sometimes led to fights with factory workers and managers because those folks were trying to protect their facilities. So in the Lichtenberg borough of Berlin, for instance, workers led by a priest chased away a werewolf demolitions squad, which was carrying a bomb to their facility toward the very end of the war. In Biala, werewolves started a fire in a factory, even though it was extinguished by workers. At Radentheim, in the eastern part of Austria, they killed pretty much a lot of the managerial staff of the local magnesium works. Those people were slaughtered by a drunken werewolf and his retinue on the 9th of May, 1945. Same thing happened with art treasures, historical landmarks. So in the werewolf reckoning, it was better to destroy that stuff than let it fall into the hands of the enemy. So werewolves engaged in several sprees of vandalism through stocks of art and antiques stored by the Berlin Museum in the Friedrichshain Flak Tower. So the Berlin Museum had stocked this material in the Flak Tower toward the end of the war to protect it from bombing. So you get several fires started by saboteurs in this installation, caused untold damage, right, to books, porcelain, sculpture, 434 paintings, including one by Botticelli, one by Van Dyck, 3 by Caravaggio, 10 by Rubens. Later in the year, werewolves in Munich set off a bomb in a depot for recovered art, not only causing material damage in that instance, but killing a worker. At Arnsberg, they set fire to a belfry in the historic church because the Americans had the goal to remove a gilded swastika from that location. Werewolves also attacked a number of German civilians, and they accused these people of defeatism or collaboration with the enemy. The Nazi-controlled press actually starts to report these attacks in December 1944. They attributed them at that point in time to avengers of German honor. It's not clear whether those attacks were real or not. When I did my work, I never attributed anything to the Nazi press because they would lie with free abandon. I think actually these stories are probably just products of wishful thinking on the part of the editors of these newspapers. But by the time you get into February, March 1945, then you actually get the long arm of the werewolf actually reaching into combat zones or reaching into the enemy-held hinterland. So on 21st February, a special team was infiltrated through the Eastern Front. They wanted to kill or kidnap Herbert von Dirksen. Herbert von Dirksen was the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, so he was a big name. He was a well-known guy. And some Nazi leaders figured that he might try and independently dicker with the Soviets. He was suspected of being pro-Soviet. So they sent these guys out to deal with him. And in this case, this infiltration team reached him, but he said he would rather go back with them than face immediate execution. Because they said, you're going to face a special court when you get back to German lines. He said, yeah, okay. And they hauled him back, but it was a grueling process, and he had a heart attack on the way back. And then he never had to face the special court. He actually survived the end of the war. It's the only piece of luck that I ever heard about that's connected to a heart attack. Next target wasn't so lucky. On the 20th of March, a werewolf parachute unit was dropped into the Netherlands. Their task was to cross the Dutch border back into Germany and then kill Franz Oppenhoff. Franz Oppenhoff was the mayor of Aachen. I'm going to go back to my map here and show you where Aachen was, or Aachen is actually. So Aachen was the biggest town in Germany, which had been taken by the Allies by the winter. It would be right around here. This location right here. It's the biggest town in Germany, which had fallen to the Allies by the winter of 1944-45. And because of that, Oppenhoff would have been the highest profile German collaborator who had agreed to work with the Allies. So he was laid low by this parachute squad on the 25th of March, 1945. They shot him and killed him. And then he was followed by a steady parade then of town mayors, policemen, priests, even defeatist Nazi officials who were laid low by their own side. So this list included the mayors of Meschede, Mutzenach, Krankenhagen, Kirklangern, Mastetten, Melbeck, Everode, the Landrat of Brunswick, the Volkssturm leader at Ingelheim, abbot of St. Trudbert Monastery down in Baden, the Kreisleiter of Kirkhorst, he's up in the Lüneburg Heath. He was accused of being a defeatist, and at least 3 parish priests. An SS team was also sent out to kill the Gauleiter of Bayreuth. So this would be Fritz Vakler. Fritz Vakler was accused by his own side of wallowing in defeatism. He was actually killed by SS people in his own Gau before the hit team ever got to him, probably at the instigation of his own deputy Gauleiter. And along with all that, scores of ordinary Germans were murdered during this period, particularly if they had the gall to run up white flags. And along with that, also hundreds of hapless foreign laborers, because Germans feared these foreign laborers as the end of the war approached, right? That they would come back to them and want vengeance. So that spate of killings, I think, was really part and parcel of a larger Nazi terror campaign that consumes Germany after the failure of the anti-Hitler putsch back in July 1944. That campaign really heats up over the winter of 1944-45. There's the issue of a decree on 13 February that sets up summary courts in areas of Germany threatened with enemy occupation. And as you can imagine, the werewolves flourish in this kind of environment, right? They tend to be oppositionalists by their very nature. And the Nazi movement actually during this period is starting to shift back to an oppositional stance, even while it's still sort of lodged in power for the final few weeks of the war. So I guess really the ultimate question is what all of this added up to. And first of all, I think it's essential to note that even though these Nazi werewolves made a nuisance to themselves, to small allied formations or their countrymen, they never really stood any significant chance of stopping the invasion or delaying the invasion or delaying the occupation of Germany. They didn't have that kind of firepower. They didn't have that kind of broad public support. And as an indication of that essential lack of support, I'm going to quote from a couple of action reports from Strife Corps leaders. These are units that function behind both, in one case, the Western Front, and in another case, the Eastern Front. So the first report I've got here is by an SS officer. He's leading a guerrilla unit near Paderborn in the spring of 1945. And he's distressed to find out that the formation's ration dump had been looted by civilians while he and his men were out on a mission to lay landmines. So he says, and I quote, "The attitude of the local civilian population is a chapter all by itself. The civilians are glad the war is over for them. They pander to the Americans in the most revolting way and bar their doors to German soldiers still willing to fight. The work here is extremely strenuous. It's extremely hard to obtain any kind of active help, even in the way of goods." And then there's a separate assessment from a Strife Corps leader operating in Silesia. This would be in February 1945. And he says, and I quote again, "We cannot expect any sudden decision to organize some sort of resistance. Though the rear areas are very thinly garrisoned and insufficiently secured, the Russians have spread such terror by their atrocities that nobody dreams of interfering with the completion of the Russian occupation." And if you might wonder what that reference to atrocities means, the Russians bore an extremely heavy hand as they occupied the eastern part of Germany. And they were sort of, fully capable of destroying any German capability to resist or will to resist their presence. I'll give an example. In the village of Kapp, a Hitler youth boy killed a Soviet officer who had raped his sister. But the Red Army then burned down approximately 70 buildings. They massacred numerous civilians and then buried them in a mass pit. And the killer then had to dig graves for himself and his parents. And then all three were toppled into these holes after they were shot. So my basic point is that it's very difficult to mount a wide-scale resistance campaign without broad public support. And the Germans, for various reasons, were unwilling to buy into this project, to buy into the werewolf campaign. And on top of that, the core SS organization at the center of the movement was poorly led. It was short of weapons. It was short of supplies. There was a lot of infighting with the other elements of the Nazi state that tried to horn in on the movement. So Krutzman thought, for instance, when Werewolf Radio started up, that this was horrible because he was conducting what he conceived of as sort of a military operation that was supposed to be surrounded by a modicum of secrecy. And here was Goebbels broadcasting the news of what they were trying to do anyway to the whole rest of the world. And also, as I've already mentioned, the intent of the movement at the start was only tactical harassment, right? Until very late in the war, they didn't make any efforts to continue on the program into the post-war period after Germany was entirely occupied. The only part of the werewolf movement that actually did that in a serious sort of way was the Hitler Jugend part, the Hitler Youth part. And they did buy some businesses before the end of the war. So they had a sort of a stream of income into the post-war period. And they tried to hold out. And in particular, they bought a trucking company. It was based at Bad Tolz up in the Alps. And they were sort of hoping, getting mobility out of that. They're sort of hoping that the Allies would give them some licenses to operate, and they could sort of move around with this trucking company as a cover. So that conspiracy was eventually broken up in spring of 1946, or about 800 arrests in March 1946. The Allies penetrated it, and they eventually broke it up. So the werewolf movement failed. Despite that, it had a significant impact. And I think this is most essentially because it widened the psychological and cultural gap between Germans and their occupiers. So the Allies and the Soviets came into Germany with all kinds of big ideas about changing the nature of Germany, and they were going to force Germans to reform. And they wanted to democratize the place, and they wanted to do re-education, and they wanted to denazify, and they wanted to decartelize, and they wanted to demilitarize Germany. And the Soviets wanted to do the same thing, but also spread their own ideology as well. So they wanted to reestablish and expand the KPD, the German Communist Party. And I would suggest that the werewolves, at least initially, vastly complicated all of those things. So the Western Allies and the Soviets both had to maintain extreme control measures, right? Because they were scared of this threat. So that means curfews, prohibitions of assembly by German civilians, travel restrictions. Those all made it hard to do anything constructive, right? Or even to sort of restore the normal rhythms of German existence. For a couple of months after the end of the war, large numbers of teenage boys were held in holding camps by the Allies. And I've got an illustration here to show you. So you can see these kids held at Bad Aibling toward the end of the war. German POWs captured during the course of the war were released only fairly slowly, I think, again, because then the Allies were sort of scared of the effect that this could have. So I think the ruling conception that people have, the reigning conception that people have about the occupation of Germany, particularly Western Germany by the British and the Americans and the French, is that it was a benign occupation. And the point I would make is at the beginning, it wasn't all that benign, right? And that fact owed to this threat, right, which was posed by the Germans. And there were Allied reprisals at this point in time, and they could be harsh, right? The essential SHAEF manual for dealing with werewolves was called Combating the Guerrilla. And by the way, this was based partly on studies which SHAEF had done, the Allied High Command had done, of what the Germans themselves had done in occupied countries, because they regarded the Germans as having quite effectively suppressed resistance. I'm not sure that was the greatest reference point actually to go to in practice. So not surprisingly, combating the guerrilla, this is a quote from Combating the Guerrilla, ineffective or half-hearted measures in the early stages will tend to be the greatest incentive and encourage not only guerrillas, but all potential guerrillas and active sympathizers. So not surprisingly, British and Canadian troops destroyed property in response to challenges that they got from armed civilians. The British, sorry, not the British, but the Americans and the French went a little bit further. They occasionally took hostages, and on a few occasions, actually, they killed these hostages. The French entirely evacuated a number of small towns and villages where there were acts of resistance. These retaliations actually continued in some cases into May and June 1945. And if that sounds harsh, it was nothing compared to what the Soviets did in the East, right? They would destroy whole communities, right? Or kill large numbers of people, even if there was only a single act of resistance. And I mentioned the village of Kup a few minutes ago, but the same type of thing happened in other places, particularly Yarmin, Shivelbein, Malkin, or a whole bunch of places where this occurred. Into the post-war period, right, well into the occupation period, they were holding large numbers of teenage boys, like those guys I showed you earlier, which has caused a lot of resentment, even to this day in Germany, right? The kind of things that the Soviets did on pretty flimsy pretexts. So I think in the final analysis, we can probably understand some of these responses by the victors to this challenge that was posed to them at that point in time in 1944 and 1945. But the very nature of circumstances made it hard for the Allies to reform Germany in the manner that they wanted, or the manner they saw fit, or to spread their political values, or even to get the country back on its feet again. There's an old cliche about making friends and influencing people, and it's hard to do that in the kind of atmosphere that I've just described for you, right? That's sort of ruled by the security mania. So much of that effect wore away, it's true, as time wore on, but many historians have noted, I think, that there was no German Revolution in 1945. There's no 1918 in 1945, either imposed from above or generated from below. And in my reckoning anyway, the presence and the activities of the werewolves had a lot to do with that. I think part of the reason for that absence of the German Revolution in 1945. And I will finish there.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I'm just going to remind the audience that if you wish to pose a question to Dr. Biddiscombe, please use the Q&A or the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and then just write your question in there, but please make them brief. In the interim, I'm going to give Dr. Biddiscombe a chance to answer some questions that I would like to pose on your behalf. The first one is, Adolf Hitler was the personification of Nazi Germany. He was the regime. If Hitler had not remained in Berlin for the last stand in 1945, and instead had withdrawn to the so-called Alpine Redoubt down in Austria and southern Germany, would his continuing existence, since all loyalty was to him, enabled the werewolf movement to develop into a more cohesive threat? I guess what I'm saying is the personification of Hitler drives the loyalty, certainly of the armed forces, and I would say by extension the werewolves. If he still exists, does that mean that the werewolf movement keeps going with a bit more enthusiasm, to use that word?
It's possible. I mean, I'm skeptical about the Alpine Redoubt. I think you mentioned earlier when we were chatting before we started that you had read Benoit's famous book about the Alpine Redoubt, the fortress that never was. And he sort of makes the case, right, that they weren't prepared to defend it, right? The only area where they'd actually taken good time to set up defensive fortifications was in the south, right? So the part of the Alps facing Italy, because there the Germans were being forced up the Italian peninsula, and they could foresee a time when they could be forced right up into the Alps, and they would have to defend those locations. And by the way, they still had sort of existing defense fortifications from World War I, Italian fortifications and Austrian fortifications to work with. In the north of the mountains, in the north of the Alps, right? If Germans were going to admit the Allies were going to close in on them from the north of the Alps, that was tantamount to admitting the war was over, right? Or the war had been lost, right? That means the Allies were in central Germany. So no one would really admit that. So that any preparations up in the north, on the north fringe of the mountains, were late. Now the Gauleiter in Tyrol and Vorarlberg, he does get at this toward the very end of the war. He constructs some fortifications along the northern fringe of the mountains. That's sort of it. I mean, there's a few industrialists who are sort of caching machine equipment in caves in the mountains. There's civilian officials moving into the mountains as other parts of Germany are threatened. There's the Steyr munitions works, right? They're up there. They make weapons, but that's nothing to do with the Alpine Redoubt, right? They've been there since the 19th century making weapons, right? So, there's not a whole lot of special preparations. And by the time you get German forces being chased into the Alps, essentially by the end of the war, right, they were sort of disorganized when they got there, and they were fragmented and they were fractured and they weren't in very good shape to fight. If they had launched a program like that, maybe at the beginning of 1944, when they still had some resources left, they might have been able to build it up, but it ran counter to everything that Hitler stood for, right? So, and Hitler, by the way, when Kaltenbrunner, the SS security chief, is eventually tasked to sort of run this project. And he has a talk with Hitler, and Hitler says, I'm not going down there. And Hitler makes this famous decision. He sort of breaks down on the 21st of April and decides he's going to stay in Berlin. And sort of, he's going to fight it out, but it's pretty suicidal by that point in time. You got to figure, had he made some sort of last-minute decision to go down to the Alpine Redoubt by that point in time, you know, he might have lasted a couple of weeks. It might have lasted a couple of weeks, and then the forces that tried to protect him would have had to get in. They would have failed to do it. They failed to do it in Berlin, and you had a lot more suitable terrain features in the Alps to defend some or to conduct a defense, but it would have failed eventually. Had he got underground, that might have been more effective. And I'm thinking here of Saddam Hussein, right? Saddam Hussein goes underground when the Americans invade Iraq. He's still out there for a while, sort of conducting propaganda and making sort of inspirational addresses and everything. That's a little more effective. Maybe if you tried that, I don't know.
Okay. The werewolf movement had two main operational goals. Originally, it was to fight and disrupt foreign enemies in occupied Germany, but eventually it also received a second task. That was to rid all Germany, either occupied or unoccupied, of traitors through assassination, like the mayor in Aachen. Was Werewolf more successful at one of these goals than the other?
Yeah, well, they're sort of shaking up German society toward the end of the war, right? And by the way, that's the main thing they're still remembered for in Germany. So a German journalist named Koop, Volker Koop, he wrote a book about this about 10 years ago. And that was his main angle of interest, right? About what kind of impact did this have in Germany? That's the main thing about it that sort of still interests Germans, at least if they're not right-wing fanatics up until this point in time. And yeah, they did that. And that's another thing I think you could argue that sort of disrupted the early phase of the occupation. There were some Germans that just weren't willing to step forward, right? I mean, the Allies are sort of looking around for town mayors. There's a lot of capable figures who wouldn't do it. And the reason they wouldn't do it is they were scared. They'd been threatened, or they were in the process still of being threatened. And they just didn't want to take their lives in their hands like that. So yeah, it had a big impact.
You provided, in your book, you provided some good reasons for the final collapse of the werewolf movement after the war. Specifically, you looked at 1947 to 48. You quoted economic recovery in Germany, the end of the denazification program in Germany, so ex-Nazis could get bureaucratic public service jobs, or whatever, allowing legal dissent through the establishment of right-wing political parties, which is obviously much better than violence, and of course the split between the West and the Soviets in different occupation zones, but also basically forcing Germans to sort of pick sides. Are they going to be with the Western powers or with the Soviets? So based on your study of guerrilla warfare, and you use this statement in your book that the acid test of successful guerrilla warfare was to draw enemy forces away from the front as a diversion. If that is the acid test, can you explain the reasons for failure of the Werewolves guerrilla war in the last few months of the war?
Okay, so I guess I would distinguish between two things here. So why does it fail in the last couple of months of the war? You got a fair degree of activity, say maybe April 1945. That's when the thing is sort of at its height. It doesn't even really work then, right? It doesn't have the intended effect, and it really doesn't draw. If it does draw Allied forces away from the front, there weren't very many of them drawn away from the front. The only area where you might have had a bit of a problem, I mentioned Bad Kreuznach earlier, right? There was sort of a lot of sniping in Bad Kreuznach by civilians, and the Allies at that point in time were trying. This was a key transportation hub, and the Allies were trying to get armor moved up to the Rhine River. You might have had some kind of effect there. Mostly, the Soviets faced some challenges in the east, but they had these big NKVD security battalions, which they had mobilized, and they just used those those were intended to address security threats anyway, so they just used those, right? They didn't divert frontline troops for this kind of thing. So it doesn't work, and I think the reason it doesn't work is because of the things I talked about earlier, because they're short of weapons, and they're poorly led, and they're disorganized, and they can't get any public support. And I think someone's mentioned here in the chat, yes, war weariness, yes. Germans, they've been fighting for 6 years, and they're fed up by this point in time. They won't support something like this. So the thing fizzles at this point in time when it was launched, even in the more moderate objective, right, which Himmler had provided for this organization, you know, just provide some diversion value. Even in that, basically, they essentially fail, right? And then those other factors, which you mentioned earlier, sort of become operative, say 1947, 1948. Well, there, you know, the thing is sort of tamped down at the end of the war, right after the end of the war. Well, why can't it revive? Right? You see sort of resistance movements in World War II doing that, right? The ones that were pitted against the Germans, right? Eventually, they pick up steam as the course of the conflict wears on, right? Why can't these guys do the same kind of thing? Why can't they revive? And those would be the answers I would provide to that question. Why can't it sort of pick up again after it's been sort of, you know, dampened by, or it's been sort of tamped down by all this Allied counteraction toward the end of the war? That's the reason, or those are the reasons, I guess, in plural.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And they seem to have a lot of difficulty where you indicated weapons, but even a lot of their caches were discovered, I'm not sure why, but were discovered quite quickly. So of course, you lose the food, you lose the rations, the weapons, the ammunition. You've got no tools to work with. I mean, you can get them from your enemy, but it takes a fair amount of effort and risk in order to get it. Yeah. Germans established, you touched on this, these regionally oriented, for lack of a better term, special forces units called SS Hunter Battalions under Otto Skorzeny. And they were tasked to provide guerrilla warfare training to the Werewolves. But they also, and you didn't talk much about this, there wasn't the time, but I understand that they also enabled and coordinated and trained anti-communist guerrilla warfare units throughout Europe. So in other words, Poles or Romanians or whatever, who were anti-communist after the Soviets had overrun most of Eastern Europe. But if these SS units, if their mandate was to conduct guerrilla warfare training in order to enable guerrillas to operate behind the lines, they were only established in late 1944. Why were they established so late? And how could they have been more successful?
So, yeah, couple of things there. So, Skorzeny took them over quite late. So Skorzeny's the sort of the SS specialist assigned to this. So he's got rising stock, right? The Abwehr is sort of in disgrace in the Nazi state by the summer of 1944, both because of their various failures and because they're sort of, you know, loosely wound up in this July 20th putsch attempt. So the Abwehr is dismantled. When the Abwehr is dismantled, various parts and subsections of the Abwehr went in various different directions, taken over by their forces, right? So Skorzeny then sort of takes over this capability of waging guerrilla warfare in areas evacuated by the Wehrmacht outside Germany. So there were sort of the rudiments of the skeletal organization already there. And it was also along the front, the Wehrmacht also had along the front in special intelligence reconnaissance units called FAK. So the Frontaufklärung Einheiten, right? So these are special front reconnaissance units. These have been operating for a long time. It's been operating since like 1942. And those had previously had contact with guerrillas operating in the Soviet rear and that sort of thing. So that was there already. It came under loose Skorzeny control when he formed the Agrabende, when he took these other organizations over from the Abwehr in September 1944. These things came under sort of very loose control by Skorzeny, and what he intended to do, he never really got around to doing, but what he intended to do for the end of the war was sort of combine the both and create a single organization. And actually I had some blowback on this by the commander of one of these FAKs and he was an elderly man, but at this point in time, it was just, I think, late 80s or 90s or something. His name was Witzel. And he said, well, we really weren't under that much Skorzeny control, which is fine. But he did have sort of loose control of these organizations. And they made, what the funny thing is about my research, I started looking at the Werewolf, right? And then I branched off into these other directions as a consequence of that, because I found out about these other organizations. I didn't know anything about them when I started. And eventually I arrived at the realization it was these other campaigns actually, which were relatively more important than the actual Werewolf campaign itself. because the Germans actually accomplished a bit more in some of these other areas because there were sort of broad anti-Soviet constituencies in some of these countries, right, where they were trying to get stuff going. So in a place like Romania, for instance, that had been an ally of theirs during the war, right up until late August 1944. So there they're trying to cultivate right-wing elements in what was already a favorable environment for right-wing elements, right? Particularly the old Iron Guard or the Legion of the Archangel Michael. They've got that. There's a significant German ethnic community in the country. And they had some success in whipping up those elements, right? And they provided a terrible time for the new Romanian government that had signed the armistice with the Soviets. And they were dropping all kinds of parachutists into Transylvania. It's a very mountainous area, like Carpathian Mountains. They were dropping all kinds of parachutists into this area, and they were really starting to stir things up. And there were some bypassed German units as well that had been caught in this area because Romania switched sides so fast that quite a few German soldiers got caught in the country and couldn't withdraw. Yeah, that is some success, right? I argued actually that this is one of the reasons why the Soviets eventually stepped in later, and they actually changed. They moved very heavy-handedly to change the Romanian government. They step in, and it's been a coalition government up until this point in time, but they knocked the coalition government out of power, and they put in a much more pro-communist government because they think that's going to be much more subservient to them, and it'll do the kind of dirty work against these guerrillas and oppositional elements that they want done. So there's that. And then in other areas, the trick for the Jagdverbände or for these FAK units, which come under Skorzeni's control, is actually to turn nationalist guerrilla units, which originally had been fielded against them, against the Soviets, which involves some, pretty delicate political gymnastics, right, to do that. Skorzeny probably wasn't the kind of person who was well suited to this type of thing anyway. But that was a tricky operation. And so this would be things like UPA, the Ukrainian Partisan Army, pretty big guerrilla organization functioning in the western part of the Ukraine, Carpathian Mountains again. Polish AK, right? Again, a huge underground organization. Chetniks in Yugoslavia, again, a pretty significant guerrilla force. And so the task that Skorzeny had was to sort of, make contact with these groups. Contact actually had already been established with some of these groups between the Germans and guerrilla officers, and sort of reinforce them, drop supplies down to them, drop training personnel down to them, drop medical personnel down to them, get them facing the Soviets and get them to cause whatever degree of harassment that they could in the face of the Soviets.
And they had kind of
they had some success. They had a considerable degree of success in doing that.
And they had kind of a toxic relationship with many of these other organizations because it was sort of a case of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of routine. They weren't necessarily pro-German so much as they were anti-Soviet.
Yes.
So there was something in common. And I guess that went all the way through any German security services that were working with guerrillas, depending on what you mentioned, the AK, the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army. Obviously, there would be no friendship there, I assume.
No, they hated, they despised the Germans with a passion, right? So and that's the one that they had the most problem with. Actually, Skorzeny is specifically directed by Himmler in the fall of 1944 to turn some of these organizations. UPA is specifically mentioned in this directive, so is the AK. And Skorzeny went out and he tried to do this, but particularly with the AK, the Ukrainians, I think, were a little more malleable, right? They could be actually sort of turned back toward German objectives. But the AK, it's not entirely clear to me that they actually managed to sort of turn the organization. The AK actually, they've got some guerrillas actually functioning in the rear of the Soviets up until the end of the war, because their government in London, the London Polish government, issued a directive in early 1945 dissolving the AK, but it was actually only a phony directive. Actually, they wanted parts of the AK to stay intact and sort of now just to swing and face the Soviets. And the Germans knew that. They had intercepted that, and they knew that was just sort of a fake order. So they saw potential there. And there were some sort of contacts here and there with sort of individual AK commanders, but that was the one that was the problem that was the hardest for them to crack, right? Because that was sort of a profoundly anti-German organization, right, in many ways. So it was hard to swing that. Yeah, but again, I would argue, and this doesn't even, we're not even talking about the Baltics. Baltics had significant guerrilla organizations. Finland, the Germans managed to set up a pretty significant underground in Finland, even though it's not really occupied by the Soviets at the end of the war. But
okay, we got some questions from the audience, and see, this is from Mark Pruel. Did the leak of the Morgenthau plan play any role in the radicalizing of werewolves and other partisan organizations?
In general, in the propaganda fed to them, it's an element, but it was sort of the general element in German propaganda all throughout the fall of 1944, right? As you can imagine, the Germans they lashed onto that really fast, right? As soon as that became public knowledge in the fall of 1944 that Morgenthau had proposed this wild scheme, right, to sort of deindustrialize Germany. As you can imagine, the Nazis trying to organize defense of the country, they lashed onto that really quickly. And they used it to motivate not only werewolves, but their defense forces in general.
Okay, another question from David Zed. Is there any evidence that the Germans learned lessons for the werewolves and the werewolf movement from anti-German resistance groups in German-occupied Europe who were at that point fighting the Nazis?
Yeah, big time. Remember I mentioned that early in the story that I told you, this would be in 1944, summer of 1944, I mentioned that the SS had set up a special investigative unit that was going to go out and look at precedents for guerrilla warfare in Germany's own recent past, but they were also going to study other examples. Yeah, these resistance movements that were pitted against the Germans were the other examples. And in fact, this SS unit actually went to Warsaw during the course of the Warsaw Uprising to see how the AK was functioning during the course of the Warsaw Uprising, because they were very interested in that. And they saw that as sort of an inspiration for their own efforts. So, yeah.
And didn't Krutzman have a role in that as well? Wasn't he in the Ukraine working on anti-partisan activity as well?
That's right. He had been. Yeah, I think I forgot to mention that when I introduced him. He had been. I think I just mentioned he was the HSSPF out in East Prussia, but he actually had right before that been in the Ukraine and running the security apparatus in Ukraine. So he had all kinds of experience fighting partisans in Ukraine. So, yeah.
Okay, I think you touched on this question, but from Alex Greer. Was war weariness a key factor in why the werewolves lacked major public support or major support from the German public?
Yeah, probably the key factor. At least as far as I've ever been able to reckon. I mean, that was probably it, right? People were just fed up by that point in time. Yeah, people late in the war, a lot of German workers are working something like 60-hour weeks, right? Particularly if they're involved in key industries. They're just frazzled, they're worn out. They were expected to participate in a Volkssturm and, to take the little free time they had and go and, show up on a parade ground and train for this, mass militia, which they knew was going to be suicidal. And on top of that, there was fear. It was fear that if you launched an effort like this, the Allies and the Soviets were going to take reprisals. You were just sort of offering the opportunity to your enemies to take reprisals on a silver platter by even organizing this kind of effort. So yeah, that's that sort of kicked the stuffing out of the werewolf organization or the werewolf campaign.
And I think that would probably be, if you had to prioritize a reason, that would probably be the main reason. If you can't get supporters and if you can't get people to cover for you or to feed you or whatever, you can't do anything. And I think you addressed that several times in your book. The lack of public support of a guerrilla movement is, fatal or whatever the exact words were. A question from John Azar, and we talked about this before we started today, is do the far-right nationalist groups in modern Germany relate themselves to historic groups like the werewolves?
Yes, they do. Yeah, they take great inspiration from that, right? Because they look at this in a reverse way than anyone else would, right? As this sort of, hopeless product of a bunch of fanatics, right? Causing useless damage toward the end of what's already been a profoundly damaging conflict. But they look at this as sort of, wow, these guys are the bitter enders, right? I mean, they stuck it out, and they proved, you know, faithful to the cause right to the last ditch. So yeah, they're inspired by that. Not only in Germany, but in some places like Russia, where they also have sort of, you know, these really virulent right-wing groups. Even there, they're sort of inspired by the werewolf. So yeah.
I think there's a big business with Russian oligarchs in buying Nazi equipment. You know, tanks and vehicles all painted up, and they have a collection. And you know, like Jay Leno would go and look at all his beautiful cars. These guys would take you into a huge garage and look at all these tanks that they've, German tanks, not even necessarily Soviet tanks.
Yeah, you got to wonder why they're doing this. I remember reading something about these Russian teenagers in Kaliningrad. So Kaliningrad would have been Königsberg, right, in the old days. This sort of that little fragment of Russia on the Baltic, right, which they actually annexed part of East Prussia after World War II. That's where their big naval base used to, I think it's still a significant naval base there. And these teenagers used to go down below the city where there were still sort of caverns and bunkers where Nazi resistors had held out, and they would go down, they would collect all their equipment, or, you know, German troops that held out in these areas too. They would go down, they would sort of collect their equipment, and it was sort of a thriving sort of underground economy or underground trade in this stuff. And you gotta wonder, it's always mystified me about why you would glorify these fanatics associated with the other side, but
well, probably a lot of it is the propaganda that comes out of Hollywood. As I said before we started, you know, what would Hollywood do without the Nazis? You know, I mean, how many movies have Nazis or themes or connections or whatever? And if you eliminated that, you know, all the Second World War, Hollywood would have nothing. So,
yeah, exactly. You mentioned to me earlier about, you know, the book's got, you know, this swastika comment. Publishers want you to do that, right? You give them something about the Nazis. They want that there because that sort of signals that, and it drives a market, right? So yeah.
Okay, a question from Jamie Hammond. Could you say a few words about the use of your work by members of the United States administration in the early years of the Iraq War? Probably referring to Donald Rumsfeld and whatnot. So
yeah, I was quoted by Donald Rumsfeld once in a speech. So what the Americans were trying to do there, as far as I've ever been able to gather, and I had quite close contact with people in the Pentagon and people in USAID at that point in time, they were trying to gather as much information as they could on these guerrillas, these Nazi guerrillas toward the end of World War II. And I think the idea was, after the end of the conventional fighting in Iraq, then you sort of have this, you know, the first sort of smoldering embers of this insurgency. And once they detected that, I think they were trying to write it off by saying, well, these were bitter enders, right? So we faced bitter enders in Germany at the end of World War II. So here's the evidence, right? They can point to this stuff, a lot of stuff that I've written. So here we faced this kind of threat at the end of World War II. It's always going to happen sort of when a totalitarian regime collapses, right? There's always going to be these diehards to try and struggle on. Probably not very many of them. Probably it's a forlorn cause. And we defeated it then with fairly minimal trouble. And we'll defeat it again. Right? This is what will happen. And it didn't turn out the same way. And I can go into reasons why I think it didn't turn out the same way, if you want me to do that. But these were two different kettle of fish, I think, in many ways. But I think that was sort of the cheap and easy route to go, right? Was to show, hey, well, we faced this type of thing before, and had no problem with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It was a totally different situation in Iraq. I mean, you had Shia versus Sunnis. It was not as simplistic, and at least in an ethnic religious sense, as you might argue Germany was, because Germans were Germans. Yes, we're Catholics and Protestants, but the divisions weren't as stark, and you had different aspects. A simplistic solution that might have worked in Germany 1945 doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in Iraq in 2004 or whatever. So
no. Not only that, but I mentioned those suppression efforts which the Allies took once they got into Germany in 1945. There's no doubt about it. It worked, right? That helped to suppress underground resistance in Germany. But when the Americans and their allies arrived in Iraq in 2003, I mean, it's a whole different presentation they're offering, right? They're supposed to be coming as liberators, right? And it's actually an invasion, but to get any kind of support at all for it, the minimum amount of support they needed, they had to present themselves as liberators. So when they arrive, they can't conduct those kinds of suppression efforts, or they can't conduct them right away. So I think everyone remembers this, right? But by I think late April and May 2003, you got sort of looters running amok in Baghdad and other Iraqi cities, and there's no security control, and there's all kinds of people going up and they're picking up weapons, or picking up weapons off the battlefield, and they're rearming themselves. And there's no attempt to collect weapons, which, by the way, again, there was in Germany in 1945. And so this is, very favorable to an insurgency starting to generate itself, right? Where that kind of thing doesn't happen in Germany. Again, because I think there were two very different kinds of circumstances.
Yeah, Alex Greer came back and he just pointed out that, which he didn't touch on, but not a problem. He just said the British punks took to the Nazis too.
Yeah.
So
true.
I mean, it's obviously it's kind of a juvenile, like tattoos, I guess. But
yeah, you think of it, the whole thing was juvenile.
Yeah, there's an appeal. They're exotic. They have exciting uniforms, or whatever the case may be. And so there's probably, what it does do is it illustrates that for a lot of young people, appeals right across national boundaries. But the Nazis were probably fairly clever in trying to use that symbolism of the werewolves, going back to the Middle Ages and the cultural aspects. They were expecting, and to a certain degree got, a fair amount of attention in Germany because of those very simplistic icons that they used. And so here it resonates yet again with a very small group of people.
Yeah, and when you think of it, I mean, it was juvenile when the Germans did it, right? It was sort of a juvenile, sort of unsophisticated set of symbols when they launched them, right? And so yeah, they appeal to similar kinds of.
Well, it worked to a degree. Yeah. Just a last question. Something we didn't touch on at all, but when the Weimar Republic was established, and of course the German army was limited to 100,000 soldiers, and there was no air force, and the navy was reduced to a couple of old battleships and a few odds and bits. High Seas Fleet had gone and been scuppered at Scataflow, so it was completely gone. So the Germans had 100,000 troops to defend a country that before the war, they'd had a minimum of, say, 600,000 troops. And the General Staff concluded that it was not possible to defend Germany on a conventional basis. Excuse me. So therefore, they set up a guerrilla warfare cell in the General Staff. And can you just talk to that and how that eventually connected to the werewolves?
Yeah, there's actually a good book on that, sort of the history of Blitzkrieg. And this was sort of an element in this. There's one theory that the German General Staff in the 1920s, because they don't have enough resources to properly protect the country, they have to be mobile, right? And then later on, sort of Blitzkrieg doctrine grows out of that initial really intense concern with mobility. But yeah, they set up a sort of a border patrol service in the 1920s, which had that kind of capability to conduct guerrilla warfare, because they had to. You're right; they're sort of flailing at that point in time, and they were scared they would be hit by the Poles in the East, right? The idea of a war between Weimar Germany and Poland certainly wasn't out of the bounds of a possibility, and they were scared that if this happened, they wouldn't be able to protect the country, and they would have to fall back on any kind of possible resource they could get. Another thing they were doing, I mentioned Black Reichswehr actually during the course of the lecture. So they're sort of also cultivating these underground remnants of Freikorps, these Freikorps that had functioned right after World War I. And these have links to the military, to military intelligence. And those are meant for domestic purposes, right? So to strike at left-wing elements, which they don't like in the Reichswehr. But also they sort of, they're not averse to actually getting Freikorps elements and using them against potential foreign enemies as well. Particularly out in the East against the Poles, but also they also rally some of these people in the Ruhr occupation in 1923 and 1924. They rally some of these people against the French as well, and they run these sort of sabotage squads in the Ruhr.
Okay.
So yeah.
I don't see any more questions. We're coming up to 2:30. So I want to thank you, Dr. Biddiscombe, for an excellent and informative presentation, and also all your time and effort, not just being with us, but also in putting it all together and trying to condense, what really covered probably about 3 different books, condense it all down into about 50 minutes. So thank you very much. And on behalf of all the members of the Royal United Services Institute of Vancouver Island, I thank you and wish you a merry day. And as I said, I'll buy you lunch.
Okay, thanks.
Some future,
No
some future date. So,
okay.
And if I get any feedback from the members on this presentation, I'll forward that to you as well, just for your
That'd be appreciated.
So, okay, so that's it. We're going to stop recording.